It started as an ordinary day at the precinct, the type of day where routine overshadowed any expectations of something extraordinary. Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop known for his no-nonsense demeanor, was in charge of booking a woman brought in for a minor disturbance. Her name was Cassandra, a confident and composed woman in her late 30s. Dressed in casual clothes with an air of dignity, she didn't seem rattled by her arrest. If anything, she appeared calm, almost too calm for Daniel's liking. As part of the intake process, the officers instructed Cassandra to remove her belongings, including her headscarf, but when she hesitated, a subtle tension filled the room. "It's just procedure," Daniel said firmly, though his tone carried little empathy. Cassandra's silence seemed to challenge him, making him feel undermined in his own station. Without further discussion, Daniels decided to take matters into his own hands, literally. He grabbed a pair of clippers from a nearby table, a gesture meant to assert control over the situation. The hum of the clippers echoed in the room as Cassandra sat motionless. Her expression remained unreadable, a mix of serenity and silent defiance. Daniels thought he was asserting authority, proving a point. But what he couldn't have known, what no one in that station could have known, was that Cassandra was no ordinary woman. Beneath the calm surface, she held a secret that would flip the entire narrative upside down. Moments later, after the last strand of her hair fell to the ground, the room fell eerily quiet. Cassandra finally broke her silence. She stood, looked Daniels in the eye, and said 5 words that froze him where he stood. "I am Judge Williams." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than the clippers he'd just dropped. Officer Daniels' face drained of color as the realization struck him. This was no simple arrest, and his actions had consequences far beyond his authority. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. And just like that, the story was no longer about power, but about accountability. What happens when the enforcer of rules discovers he's violated them against someone with the power to change his fate? Stay tuned. The streets were quiet that night, dimly lit by flickering streetlights. Officer James Walker was on his usual patrol in the downtown district, a place he often referred to as the jungle. He had been with the force for over 10 years, and while his badge symbolized service and protection, his actions often told a different story. To James, certain people just didn't deserve the same level of respect as others. That belief had shaped the way he did his job, and tonight was no exception. At the corner of 5th and Main, a man sat hunched on the sidewalk, wrapped in a tattered old coat. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and a cardboard sign rested next to him with the words "hungry and cold" scribbled across it. James slowed his patrol car as he spotted the figure. To him, the sight was all too familiar, another homeless man cluttering up the city in his mind. James pulled the car over and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Hey, you can't sit here," he barked, walking toward the man. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. That silence only irritated James further. "Did you hear me?" he said, louder this time, as he stood towering over the man. "You can't just loiter around here. Get up and move." The man shifted slightly, but still didn't say a word. His calm demeanor, almost like he was unfazed by the officer's tone, only fueled James's frustration. The officer leaned down, his hand gripping the man's shoulder. "I said get." Before James could finish, the man slowly raised his head, locking eyes with him. There was something about those eyes, something that made James hesitate for a split second, but his ego quickly took over. "Don't play games with me," James growled. In an attempt to assert control, James escalated, shoving the man lightly as if to provoke a reaction. Still, there was no fear, no anger, no begging, just that same calm, unsettling stare. By now, a few people walking by had stopped to watch the interaction from a distance. The man finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "You really think you know who I am?" he said, tilting his head slightly. James froze for a moment, caught off guard by the unexpected question, but quickly masked it with more aggression. What he didn't know, however, was that every word, every action, was being watched and recorded. James felt the weight of the man's words sink in, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, his voice sharper now. "You're breaking the law, and that's all I need to know." The man didn't flinch, his calmness only unsettling James further. The man smirked slightly, tucking the wallet back into his pocket. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said calmly. "But I'm not here to flash a badge. I'm here to watch, to listen, to see how far people like you are willing to go." James's throat tightened. He could feel the shift in power, the way the man's calm confidence seemed to pull the rug out from under him. "You think you can just come out here and play games?" he snapped, trying to regain control. "You're out of line." "Am I?" the man asked, his voice steady, almost daring. "Or are you just upset that someone's finally watching you the way you watch others?" The words cut deeper than James wanted to admit. He glanced at the crowd, now openly recording and whispering. His mind raced, trying to figure out a way to salvage the situation. But the man wasn't finished. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "You've made a lot of choices over the years, and I've seen every one of them. Tonight, we're going to find out what happens when the tables turn." James could feel the tension in his chest growing, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The crowd, the badge, the cryptic warnings, it was all too much. For the first time in a long time, James didn't know what to do. And as the man stood there, unshaken, James realized that this wasn't just about tonight. It was about something much bigger, something he couldn't escape. The air between them felt heavy, almost suffocating. James' confidence had cracked, but he wasn't about to let it show. Not here, not now. He glanced around at the growing crowd, their phones pointed like weapons, capturing everything. He knew the wrong move could end his career, or worse. But as the man stood there, calm and unwavering, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. This man had been planning something, waiting for this moment. Before James could say anything else, a voice crackled over his radio. "Unit 12, we've got a report of suspicious activity near your location. Please confirm your status." James instinctively reached for the radio, but before he could respond, the man interrupted. "Careful what you say," the man said, his voice low enough that only James could hear. "You never know who's listening." James's hand froze, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the man. "What the hell are you talking about?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer, but the faintest hint of a smirk crossed his face. It was a calculated move, just enough to push James further to the edge. And then, as if on cue, another figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, walked up to the scene with an air of quiet authority. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. She stopped a few feet away, her hands tucked into her pockets. "Officer Walker," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. James turned to her, his confusion quickly masked by irritation. "Who are you and what do you want?" he demanded, his tone harsher than he intended. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her own badge and held it up for everyone to see. "Special Agent Carter, FBI," she said simply. The crowd gasped, and James felt his stomach drop again. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. First the man, now her. This was no coincidence. "What's going on here?" James asked, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts to stay composed. Agent Carter's gaze shifted to the man, then back to James. "I think you know," she said, "or at least you're starting to." She stepped closer, her tone growing colder. "We've been investigating you for months, Officer Walker. Every action, every report, every complaint. And tonight, we wanted to see how far you'd go when you thought no one was watching." The weight of her words hit like a sledgehammer. James' mind raced, replaying every decision he'd made that night, and every questionable call he'd made in the past. "You can't just," he started, but Carter cut him off. "Oh, we can," she said sharply, "and we have. You've been under surveillance for a while now, Officer Walker. And you'd be surprised how much a camera can capture when you think no one's paying attention." James's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about tonight. This was a setup, a carefully planned operation to expose him. And the worst part, he didn't even know how much they had on him. The man who had been silent during Carter's confrontation finally spoke up. "The question isn't what we know," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" James felt trapped, the walls closing in around him. The crowd was watching, recording, waiting for his next move. His career, his reputation, his entire life, it all hung in the balance. The man slowly stood up, brushing dust from his coat. He was taller than James had expected, but he still looked like someone who had been on the streets for years, worn boots, frayed sleeves, and hands calloused from hard living. "You really should care," the man said softly, his voice just loud enough for James to hear. There was no fear in his tone, only an edge of warning that James couldn't quite place. James stepped closer, determined not to lose control of the situation. "You think you're tough," he sneered, keeping his hand near his belt as if ready to act. "I've dealt with plenty like you. You don't scare me." Meanwhile, across the street, a young woman pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the interaction. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered to her friend, "This doesn't look right. Should we call someone?" The friend hesitated, unsure, but the unease in the air was palpable. More people were stopping now, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. The man glanced briefly at the growing crowd before looking back at James. "You don't know who's watching, do you?" he said, his voice steady. The words hit harder than James wanted to admit. He turned his head slightly, noticing for the first time the bystanders with their phones out. His jaw tightened. "Mind your own business," he barked at them, his voice rising. But even as James tried to assert dominance, he felt the shift in the air. Something about this man wasn't adding up. Most people in his position would be pleading or running by now. Instead, this guy stood there like he was waiting for something, like he had nothing to lose. What James didn't realize was that the man had been watching him long before this night. Every word, every action, every decision James had made on the job, it had all been carefully observed. And now, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but not in the way James expected. For years, James had worked in a system that allowed him to push boundaries without consequence. But tonight, he was about to find out what it felt like to be on the other side of the power dynamic. The man finally broke the silence again. "You think your badge protects you?" he asked, his tone colder now. "It doesn't protect you from the truth." James's face flushed with anger, but behind it, a small seed of doubt had been planted. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just an encounter with another homeless man. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would shake his entire world. And as the crowd grew and the tension thickened, James was forced to confront the one question he couldn't answer. Who, exactly, was this man? James clenched his fists, trying to maintain control of the situation, but his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The man wasn't just calm, he was deliberate, almost as if he were testing James. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice, but making it sharper. "You think you can come out here and make me look like a fool? Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Regret?" he repeated, almost like he was rolling the word around in his mind. "You're the one who should be thinking about that." The crowd across the street was growing, their murmurs turning into audible commentary. "What's he doing?" one voice asked. "Is that guy homeless, or is this something else?" The woman with the phone continued recording, her camera trained on every word and movement. She whispered to her friend, "I think there's more to this. This guy doesn't seem scared at all." James felt the pressure mounting. He could feel the eyes on him, the silent judgment of the onlookers. His entire career had been built on control, control of his environment, control of people, control of the narrative. But right now, it felt like the control was slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to tighten his grip, the more it seemed to fall apart. Enough of this, James snapped, taking another step forward. You've got two options: move along or spend the night in a cell. Your choice. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat, moving slowly, deliberately. James' hand instinctively went to his belt, his adrenaline spiking. "Keep your hands or I can see them," he barked, his voice louder now, filled with tension. The man paused, then pulled out a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open and held it up just enough for James to see. In that moment, James' entire demeanor shifted. His eyes darted to the badge inside the wallet, then back to the man's face. The letters stared back at him like a silent warning: FBI. The crowd, still unaware of what was happening, continued to watch, some stepping closer for a better look. James felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to keep his face neutral. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, though his voice had lost some of its edge. The street was quieter now, with the crowd slowly dispersing after watching James Walker taken away. People whispered to each other, phones still in their hands, sharing the footage they had just recorded. For many, it was a moment of reckoning, proof that no one, not even those in positions of authority, was untouchable. Agent Carter stood still, the weight of the night settling over her. She glanced at the man beside her, the undercover agent who had orchestrated the entire operation. "We got what we needed," she said softly, almost as if convincing herself. The man nodded but didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted toward the phone in his hand, the ominous message still displayed on the screen. The warning wasn't unexpected, but it confirmed their fears. They had pulled a thread, and now they were starting to see how tangled the web really was. "Walker was just a piece," the man finally said, his voice low. "The system that protected him. That's what we're really up against." Carter nodded, her jaw tightening. She knew he was right. Tonight was a victory, but it was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Still, there was no room for hesitation. They had exposed a corrupt officer and sent a clear message. Accountability was no longer optional. As the two walked back toward their car, the man glanced back at the street, now almost empty except for a few lingering bystanders. "You think the people will remember this?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Carter looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "They'll remember," she said, "but more importantly, they'll see that things can change." The night was far from over for Carter and the man, their work continuing in silence as they prepare for the battles ahead. But for now, the first step had been taken, and the truth had come to light. And while it didn't fix everything, it was a start, a crack in the foundation of something much larger, one that, with time, might finally collapse.